So let me simply introduce you briefly and return to my role as chair. Professor Harsh V Pant is Professor of International Policy, International Relations at the King's India Institute in London, and he's the director of studies and head of the Strategic Studies program at the Observer Research Foundation, where you are located, I suppose, at the moment, Harsh, huh? Since this is more than a full-time job, in fact. And his current research focuses on Asian security issues. Among his most recent books, I would mention New Directions in India's Foreign Policy Theory and Praxis, that's Cambridge University Press, and India's Nuclear Policy, that's Oxford University Press. So we are now very much eager to listen to you and for presenting India in the Indo-Pacific, semicolon, a foreign policy reoriented.
Thank you, Christoph, and my apologies for this delay. There was, I think I can share my screen, right? So I hope you can see it.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. So as Christoph said, I will be talking about India, Indo-Pacific, and I think in a way, Indo-Pacific has become the central pillar, central pivot around which Indian foreign policy debates and discussions are evolving to a large extent. And if you look at the relationships, the partnerships India is building, if you look at the kind of investments, diplomatic, military, etc., that India is making, Indo-Pacific has given India a certain kind of a strategic framework around which to frame its ideas, its interests, and its institutional frameworks as well. And I wanted to begin by simply mentioning some of the things like, when we talk of the Indo-Pacific, when we talk of the sense of, when we take a particular name, what does it imply? In a sense, geography has been always been a very important determinant of any nation's foreign policy. And often it is argued that, look, geography is something that is immutable. Geography is something that doesn't change, and therefore you have to, geography imposes certain constraints on a country. And I think India has been facing that constraint for a very long time, in the sense of its continental border, continental issues. Both if you look at India's important challenges in the way of Pakistan and later on in the form of China, it has been this idea that the northern frontier of India is a very problematic frontier. It imposes constraints on India. And of course, the geographical coordinates of India being a South Asian country, Indian Ocean region country, also imposes its own sets of constraints, being embedded in the larger conflicts, in the larger competition, in the larger strategic rivalries of the region. But geography, what is interesting about geography is that in some ways, one can argue that geography is not that kind of a constant as perhaps we would have we would envision. Geography, our geographical mindsets, our geographic imaginations also evolve with the strategic realities around us, and that gives the framing of our geographical frontiers, therefore, become a very important factor in the way we think about our strategic challenges, in the way we think about, nations think about their strategic challenges. Nations think about, where to put resources, how to invest there, where to, what kind of partnerships to build. And in that sense, the Indo-Pacific as a mental map, as an it has been very interesting exercise for India in particular, and of course for a lot of other countries as well. But for India, in terms of reimagining its strategic frontiers, in reimagining what perhaps India can and cannot do with its neighbors, how far India can extend, what kind of partnerships it can build, what kind of contours of strategic relationships it can evolve. And therefore, in a sense, Indo-Pacific has given India a much greater breadth in terms of its foreign policy reimagination. And so when you look at, this debate from Asia Pacific to the Indo-Pacific, this debate has a long trajectory, long genealogy. We have been talking about Asia Pacific since 1960s onwards. And always the idea was that, look, Asia Pacific is something that is distinct from South Asia. We used to, even today, if you pick up a textbook on international relations, it would define Asia in ways, it would define Asia's boundaries in ways that would often come to us, that would often be expressed as Asia Pacific and South Asia. Most countries were also framing their policies accordingly, and it was understood as a region in some ways connecting Northeast and Southeast Asia with Oceania, and therefore Asia Pacific became the center around which American commitment to the region also evolved post Second World War. The institutionalization of this part of the world also evolved, and that led to this idea that Asia Pacific is a geography where India is not a natural, where India is not embedded in. And this had strong, I think, connotations for Indian foreign policy, strong reverberations and consequences for Indian foreign policy, and India's own ability to shape the agenda in and around its periphery. And however, from 1990s onwards, when we see India started emerging as an economic power, India started emerging as a more ambitious power that wanted to project its interests in East Asia and beyond just the Indian Ocean, that sense started getting more fluid. And of course, when you had the sense that, look, China's entry, China's rise was transforming the way this part of the world was shaping up. And in that sense, in that mix was thrown, in India was thrown, where this disjuncture, this distinction between Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean became less and less relevant. Now, if you think about the strategic genealogy, if you think about the political genealogy of this, of course, the most important role in this was played by former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And in his, and I think the speech that he gave, in Indian Parliament in mid-2000s, when he talked about the confluence of the two seas, that was a landmark speech because he was the first one to lay out in some detail the strategic rationale behind why he thought that Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans should no longer be seen as two distinct seas. Rather, they have to be looked at as one contiguous maritime zone. And what he was arguing then, and this was very early on in mid-2000s, was basically alluding to the scale and scope of change that was happening in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean, and particularly insofar as the rise of China was concerned. The sense that China's rise has challenged the way nations are confronted with a strategic reality became one of the most defining elements, perhaps for Shinzo Abe's articulation of this, but also for many other countries that were looking at the region and they were looking at their own interests and how they were being impacted. And what Abe was making a case, he was saying that, look, if you have to respond to this change in the, in the strategic map, if you have to respond to this shift in the Indian Ocean and in this larger maritime space, then you have to think more creatively about how the balance of power in this region can be stabilized. How can we keep the free and open nature of the seas? How can we keep on maintaining the free and open nature of the seas? And this can't be done unless we bring the two seas together in our strategic imaginations. And he, because he was speaking to Indian parliamentarians, he in fact was exhorting them to do more in the Pacific, to do more in the East. He said this sense that India is an Indian Ocean power, Indian Ocean state. Of course, India has geographical advantages in the Indian Ocean, but India as a rising power, as an aspirational power, needs to think beyond Indian Ocean, needs to connect Indian Ocean to Pacific Ocean more and more. And in that sense, that was a very powerful articulation of what Indo-Pacific meant. And then we also saw immediately after his speech this idea of India, US, Japan, and Australia coming together as a quadrilateral. Now, of course, at that point in time, the Quad, it was talked about, but it did not go very, it could not go very much forward. But I think the seeds had been sown in fundamental ways in terms of how various countries, how critical anchors in the region need to be responding to this challenge. And therefore, as we see Indo-Pacific becoming this theater for strategic competition, as we see important trade corridors, important energy pipelines passing through these lanes, the sense that this region cannot be looked at through the older prism has become much and more vibrant. And of course, the emergence and the push by India and China has made it virtually impossible for India and China and other actors to ignore this part of the geography, which we are now seeing as the re-emergence, in fact, of this vast maritime space. Now, for India, therefore, it has been a long journey. From mid-2000s onwards, thinking about Indo-Pacific, then moving in towards Quad for some time, and then taking a step backwards and saying that this can be too problematic. But other nations were moving rapidly forward, in particular Japan and Australia. Yeah, so this was, I was talking in terms of India articulating this position at Prime Minister Modi doing that at Shangri-La for the first time. And this is what it looks like if you think in terms of the expanse that India wants to fit in its Indo-Pacific definition and imagination. And this puts it, in somewhat of a difficult position because some of its partners see differently. Some don't. But India's point being that this is how for India it looks like the issues concerned are interconnected in this geographical space, and therefore in some ways that is so this is if you think of perhaps some of the things that India has been trying to articulate is that from the shores of Africa to that of the Americas, and then saying that, look, this is also in some way the ASEAN centrality is critical for India if it in terms of the it's thinking about Indo-Pacific. So critical and centrality of ASEAN being critical for India is something that accords well with what some of India's partners have also articulated, that ultimately ASEAN is going to be the defining element here, which again poses its own sets of challenges and opportunities. And now, of course, as far as India is concerned, Indian Ocean remains at the very heart of this of its articulation, because most of its identity, its interests are connected with that. And the way, for example, Jaishankar, Foreign Minister, defines it, Indian Foreign Minister defines it, is also in terms of three concentric circles, where you have the immediate neighborhood, and then you move forward from there, where largely moving all the way to the wider Indo-Pacific. But in terms of its vision, in terms of the fundamental norms, and in terms of where the convergences have emerged with like-minded countries, these are some of the principles that that have been at the heart of the way India has defined it, and the way some of its partners have defined it. So in some ways, inclusivity, as I was mentioning earlier, has been key, because in theory you can argue that even if China, for example, argues that we are all for freedom of navigation and openness, then it is also part of the Indo-Pacific geography. It can adapt to this strategic mapping. Now, therefore, the idea is because India had been very conscious of this fact that one of the arguments that are often put forth, in particular by China, is that this is about containing China, that this is about keeping China off balance, and this larger geography is not about making China feel welcome. So therefore, for India, inclusivity is key, and of course, rules-based international order is important. Again, common spaces, equal access to them. So if you're talking of freedom of navigation, unimpeded commerce, peaceful settlement of disputes, this is about how do you accommodate various interests, various groups as far as common spaces are concerned. And of course, this is fundamentally also driven by the sense that most trading regimes, trading environment and stable trading order is critical, Indo-Pacific being at the heart of this global trading body. And finally, you had the sense of connectivity, which has been, again, an interesting contestation, and increasingly a contestation now between, between a large part of the world and China. But India, when BRI was announced, was one of the first countries to challenge Belt and Road Initiative along similar lines that India has mentioned here, that in its argument about connectivity, with which principles should govern connectivity, whether it is respect for sovereignty, whether it is good governance, transparency, financial viability, economic viability, sustainability, all of those norms that are now talked about in terms of connectivity principles, they have been part of this discussion as far back as when BRI was initiated, and India became one of the first countries to challenge it frontally, not to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, in terms of the pretext, it is what is interesting in some ways is that for a very long time, India's engagement in the region was moving in a certain direction, and the direction was clearly articulated in more ways than one, particularly by the Indian Navy, which was from the very beginning, as it was trying to redefine its doctrines and its strategies, was very clearly articulating the need for India's much more expansive role in its periphery. And it was also interesting because Indian Navy and the naval thinkers in India had always claimed that, look, while India's geography on the north is a constraint, India's geography in the south is an opportunity. This sense that India is geographically advantageous in the Indian Ocean, that's something that India should exploit. And we can go back all the way to K.M. Panikkar, for example, writing in 1947, talking about how Indian Ocean is critical for India to define its identity. Therefore, Indian Navy and naval thinkers have been at the heart of some of this debate in shaping the legacy. And so we have seen right from the early 2000s, as Indian Navy started getting more resources, it also became more ambitious in defining its role. And what is also interesting is that Indian Navy was doing this without India having a national security strategy. That in the absence of a national security strategy, Indian Navy was driving the agenda as far as Indian Ocean engagement is concerned, and broader India's engagement in the wider Indo-Pacific is concerned. And then, of course, you have later on, for example, in 2015, you had the Sagar Security and Growth for All in the region, which is announced. And then India also in 2018 defines its Indo-Pacific vision. But there is a legacy issue here in terms of who was driving the discourse for a very long time, and Indian Navy and naval thinkers were doing it in more ways than one. And of course, the target was that there was someone who was breaking the rules in this wider engagement, and therefore that pushback from India was needed, as many in India would have argued. Now, gradually, what was happening was that China's rise was also making India aware that India's, that old argument that Indian Ocean is India's ocean, that in some ways Indian Ocean, India has geographical advantages in Indian Ocean which are very difficult to overcome. That also became a bit less sustainable as China's naval rise also starts impinging itself in the Indian Ocean. China became a major player in the Indian, it starts becoming a major player in the Indian Ocean in 2000s. China starts deploying its resources. China starts its capabilities. China starts becoming a major trading partner and then a defense partner for a large number of Indian Ocean countries. And of course, later on came the Belt and Road Initiative, etc. But there is the issue here about China's increasing rise, increasing role in the Indian Ocean, and China's disengagement and tensions emerging with India, along with a number of other countries, which India felt very uncomfortable with. So in a sense, China's rise and China's aggression, which meant that you had the issues around territorial sovereignty in the maritime space first getting expressed. So the South China Sea dispute as it escalated, East China Sea dispute with Japan as it escalated. And later on, of course, you had the land border dispute with India. But before the land border dispute, many years before that land border dispute, maritime disputes were very, very visible. And for many in India, that was a warning sign that, if China is trying to unilaterally alter the status quo in the maritime space, then land borders will not be far behind. And that's exactly what happened in the context of Galwan crisis of 2020. Now, what India had been doing in terms of its diplomacy, its outreach was a strong exercise in maritime capacity building. So when you look at the growing presence of certain powers in the region, the ideas in India started emerging about India becoming a provider of net security in the region. Can India do that? Does India have the capabilities? And I think all those questions started coming together. But if you see over the last few years, that maritime capability, capacity building has been a large part of India's naval outreach in the region. To a lot of countries in and around the region, India has been gradually moving in terms of naval power accretion to a certain extent that now that the deal between India and the Philippines on the BrahMos missiles also adds another dimension, which is about India finally taking the plunge and also deploying some of its capabilities, in the right outside Chinese periphery. Related to the naval outreach, the diplomatic outreach had also been pretty extensive in the sense of how India had been had been relating its defense ties, diplomatic ties with its trade ties, and also thinking a bit more creatively on the infrastructure ban. Now, Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which came out as a response to BRI, has not really taken off. But what it articulated at that point in time was this desire on the part of India and Japan, at least in the initial phase of their response to BRI, that there are things that countries which are like-minded, and in this case, India and Japan, can do together for a number of countries which are perhaps too dependent on China or have no alternative to China. So in a sense, the smaller countries in the region, the smaller states in the region in South Asia, Southeast Asia, even in Africa, which was to Africa, this idea was based on this assessment that India and other like-minded countries will have to come in a big way in infrastructure and connectivity if the challenge of China has to be managed. And that has been from there onwards, although again, as I said, Asia-Africa Growth Corridor has not been very, very visible in recent years. But what India and Japan are doing bilaterally is now reflecting in some of the things that this growth corridor project brought about. Now, in a sense, what it also did, this idea of Indo-Pacific, it has also allowed India to start thinking about issue-based coalitions, issue-based partnerships. Now, if you look at and this has given Indo-Pacific has given that Indian foreign policy that grounding. And if you see, for example, under Modi, India has moved very, very fast on the US and Europe in particular, but also in terms of defining the mid-power coalitions in Indian Ocean and the wider Indo-Pacific. So if you look at, for example, Japan and Australia, very strong relationships, trilateral relationships, bilateral relationships with them, but also India and France, which perhaps is a unique relationship in its own right, as they tend to do so much together in terms of Indian Ocean, and in so far as their outreach that this sense of strategic autonomy that binds India and France together ideationally is also a very critical part in India's comfort level with France in working together. So what we have seen over the last few years is this idea of Indo-Pacific has galvanized some of these partnerships, which were looking for some grounding. There was often a concern that was expressed in India that many of these partnerships were losing momentum. But I think what Indo-Pacific has done is certainly galvanize a number of these partnerships, given India that space to move away from a very structured multilateral framework to a more ad hoc, functional mini-lateral framework, for example, Quad or other trilaterals, and to start thinking more creatively about what kind of an institutional architecture is needed in the Indo-Pacific. And therefore, in a sense, from the eastern shores of Africa to Oceania, these have been driven by a number of these mini-lateral groupings in the Indo-Pacific, and the fundamental reality being that all of them getting concerned about that certain norms are being challenged, certain structural features, balance of power being reshaped, and the lack of institutions available in the region to manage this transition. And ultimately, if you see in terms of the articulation of a framework, there are a number of these groupings that have come up as I was discussing, but also a number of frameworks like IORA or IONS, Indian Ocean Naval Symposium. Now, there you also see this partnership with critical actors like EU and ASEAN developing. Now, I think EU partnership has been one of the most interesting ones because EU for a very long time did not view itself as a geopolitical player. Now, over the last few years, as the European Union's identity has changed, has evolved towards a more active geopolitical posturing, we have seen India and the EU doing much more together in terms of Indo-Pacific and in terms of thinking about what perhaps can be done in articulating a response to both China's rise and to US-China contestation. So I think this provides both EU and India this alternative framework. Indo-Pacific provides that to take some of those conversations that were stuck for a very long time. I think if you see India-EU relationship today, it is going very strong. It is very interesting. It is in a very interesting phase. Some of the things, for example, that both sides used to crib about free trade agreement, which in particular is also seeing signs that we are moving in a direction where EU-India free trade agreement will also see the light of the day in some form, not perhaps a more comprehensive trade agreement, but a limited agreement, which India has done with countries like Australia and even is in talks with UK. So what is interesting here is that Indo-Pacific has galvanized some of these partnerships into thinking more creatively and into pushing the boundaries of their existing arrangements forward. And of course, the Quad has been one of the more interesting innovations, and I call it an innovation because it's an interesting idea. It's a concept. It's a grouping. It's a platform. You can call it what you want. But what Quad is, and the reason why it is so interesting, is that India's role in Quad makes it interesting. India has always been very, and even as I was telling earlier, in 2007, when it was first talked about, India was very reluctant to join a grouping like this, which had a very, very clear message coming out of it. Even if you look at these four leaders, the message is very clear as to what is being targeted, which country is being talked about, which country is seen as a potential challenge. So India was very reticent in joining any of these platforms. Now, post 2017, when Quad was resurrected, and resurrected partly because, and it could be resurrected partly because of China's own policy failures, I would argue, because the way China responded to India and Australia from 2007 to 2017 basically made it inevitable that some kind of grouping would emerge. Now, what makes it interesting is that Australia and Japan are already treaty alliance partners of the US. So for them to work together and come and think about strategic challenges is not new. What makes Quad interesting and innovative is that India has joined, and India has joined without signing any treaty agreement with either of these countries. So India's entry into Quad is a very interesting innovation in the way perhaps we are going to see mini-laterals and the institutional frameworks evolve in the Indo-Pacific in particular, where we do not see this desire to have treaty alliance partnerships of the old variety. And therefore, we have also seen much greater acceptance of India by the Biden administration as it has developed the Quad over the last 2-3 years. While Trump was very vociferous and he came out with the free and open Indo-Pacific approach of the US, it was Biden that has really invested in the kind of multilateral frameworks, in the kind of mini-lateral, I would call, frameworks that are emerging in the Indo-Pacific. And he has, and Quad has been perhaps where a lot of investment has gone. So in a sense, when you see the journey of Quad in the last 3 years, it has been quite remarkable with the kind of activity and with the kind of articulation that it has had, with all the challenges about whether Quad can perhaps perform the role that it is expected to do, etc., etc. And one can come to it in a later discussion. But what I'm trying to point out here is that Quad, in some ways, it seems to be an inevitable response to the structural challenges in the region, where there is an institutional dysfunctionality, where there are no institutions that can manage that strategic flux. And so the other element which I wanted to bring here is India's focus on its neighborhood and BIMSTEC and Indian Ocean region, which has been somewhat interesting in terms of, again, reimagining India's neighborhood. Now, for a very long time, this for the last almost 70 years, the sense was that India has to get its partnership or its relationship with Pakistan right before anything can happen on the neighborhood. Now, I think what we have seen is that New Delhi has turned it on its head. In the last several years, India has not really engaged Pakistan, but has moved to the Bay of Bengal periphery much more creatively. Because for India, Bay of Bengal and BIMSTEC, which is the regional platform, they're allowing Bay of Bengal community to come together. Bay of Bengal and BIMSTEC present an interesting opportunity because that, of course, Bay of Bengal links India directly to the wider Pacific, wider Indo-Pacific, but also because through this platform, through BIMSTEC, which has countries like Myanmar and Thailand as its members, India can also claim that India is also a Southeast Asian country in some ways. India is connected to Southeast Asia organically. India doesn't have to be invited to Southeast Asia or to the wider Pacific as an external power. India shares boundary with Myanmar. India has historical ties with several countries in the region. And therefore, India's entry into Southeast Asia and the wider Pacific becomes much more organic and much more normal in that scheme of things, which I think is something that India has played on to in the last few years in terms of pushing the focus of its neighborhood policy away from the western frontier to the eastern frontier. And that has meant that this has given India much greater thrust in its Indo-Pacific outreach. Now, I will end by just pointing out that, so far, I think Indo-Pacific story has been one of opportunities for India. It has been a story of partnerships, of relationships, new relationships. Also because a lot of the other actors, US and EU in particular, individual EU countries like France, Germany, Netherlands, who have had their own Indo-Pacific policies, but also EU as an actor have been investing a lot in thinking about Indo-Pacific, what kind of a role they can play there, what kind of an alternative structure they can create there with like-minded countries. So it has been a relatively positive story for Indian foreign policy. The challenges, of course, are equally remarkable and serious, because the more ambitious India becomes in the Indo-Pacific, it would require, first of all, much greater resources in implementing the vision and implementing the kind of role that India wants to play in this very, very wide maritime space, from Africa all the way to Oceania. It's a huge maritime space where India wants to engage much more substantively. And we have seen some flux in the institutional arrangements that we have seen. I've talked about Quad in the Pacific, but there is also another Quad in the Middle East that is emerging, where you have India, US, Israel, and UAE sitting together. So for India, that is also part of the Indo-Pacific. And in some ways, that management of its Middle East policy is also going to be a very interesting feature for India as it moves forward in this vast space. So the first issue becomes the issue of resources and alignments. The second becomes this issue of the world is becoming fragmented and polarized. And so you have a situation where US-China contestation is taking on a dimension which is an altogether new as far as the last several decades are concerned, primarily because the US-China rivalry also is embedded in a larger economic relationship, where the two nations are very important economic partners of each other, and where China is a very, very important economic player also for a number of other countries in the region. So when you look at that challenge as to how do you navigate this binary, how do you navigate this challenge between US and China? In some ways, at the moment, it's a no-brainer, because the deterioration in India-China relationship especially since March 2020 Galwan Valley crisis, has opened up new space for India. But India also is very conscious of the fact that at some point, China being its largest and most important neighbor, what kind of a relationship it will have with China, and to make China a part of its foreign policy matrix, where at this point in time, China is mostly absent because of the challenge at the border. So there is, of course, fundamentally the China challenge for India, which in some ways galvanizes the Indo-Pacific, but in some ways it also constrains India's options in the Indo-Pacific, because the more China gets belligerent, the more China becomes aggressive, and the more it destabilizes the region. For India to extract opportunities from the Indo-Pacific, from this maritime space, from this maritime geography, would become increasingly difficult. So that, I think, is the framing through which and I would look at India's role in the Indo-Pacific and the challenges that it is facing in the region. Much though I think the focus has been largely on the opportunities that it has created for a country like India, that for a long time was trying to come out of this straitjacket of being a quote-unquote South Asian and Indian Ocean power. I think Indo-Pacific narrative, Indo-Pacific framing allows India to play a more expansive role in the world and in one theater, which is perhaps becoming the center of gravity of global politics and global economics. I will end there, Christoph. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Harsh, for this very comprehensive and balanced presentation, very sophisticated and detailed. Thank you very much. There are already questions in the Q&A box. I will limit myself to 2 points. First of all, if you don't mind, I'd like to return to Abe's invitation to India to look east even more and to invest in the Pacific. That was many years ago. How has this been responded Can you say a little bit on what India is doing in the Andamans, for instance, and also possibly the negotiation with Indonesia for a military basis? Is it what could be seen as a response to Abe's invitation? And my second question would be about the economic dimension that you have highlighted as well. Last year, India preferred not to join fully the Indo-Pacific economic framework that Biden had initiated. The trade pillar is more or less the missing link in this. How do you interpret that? And how do you see this economic framework taking shape, making some difference vis-a-vis RCEP, for instance, the China's led trade zone. If you don't mind, we'll begin with these two questions and then we'll turn to those who are in the box.
Thanks, Christophe. I think Abe's invite was very critical because he was seen as someone who was determined to change Japan's posture also vis-a-vis the world, and he did to a certain extent. Today, if you look at Japan, it's a very different country. Even Kishida is now taking on where Abe left and completely redefining Japan's security policies. And Abe himself was seen as a friend. So when he articulated this vision, I think it had a great impact because it was not coming from the traditional West, where if the Western countries would have raised this, there would have been so many hackles in India. This is some conspiracy by the West to lure India into something. But because Abe was making it, because he was also doing something in Japan which were quite unprecedented. I think it had a great psychological effect in India. It almost, I would say, at that point in time, we didn't realize it, but it shook India in some ways that, look, there is something happening and we are not there yet. That we have not yet, we have not really reached a position where a friend like Abe could also, almost take credit for saying that, look, India is doing this and this. Abe was basically saying India needs to do much more, and therefore, for a lot of Indians, it was an inflection point in the way you thought about a very important part of the world. Now, I would say that a process started then in terms of thinking, and then much like all things in India, it took some time. As they say, Indian elephant dances very slowly, if it dances at all. Then I think by the time it started dancing, I think we are now today looking at an elephant that is dancing quite a bit in its own way. And I would, in some ways, what you were suggesting, two things you said, Andamans and Singapore, but also in terms of reaching out to very, very substantively and creatively to countries like Philippines and Vietnam, in terms of defense cooperation. And I think being propelled almost by this larger cause of history that, look, Andamans is a very, very critical anchor for India in a very important part of the world. And that utility of Andamans had not been fully explored. And a lot of the other countries, in fact, had been very, very interested in how India would use Andamans as a frontier post in more ways than one. So I think we have seen a lot of investment now happening in building up Andamans as an entity that can respond to some of India's challenges, and a lot of work with other like-minded countries that are coming and investing in the Andamans, engaging with what is happening there. Indonesia, I think Indonesia, we would have done much more, but perhaps there was also some sense that Indonesian government was a bit lackadaisical. I think we have not the reciprocity has not been there. And of course the whole idea of maritime fulcrum that at one point was very popular was articulated in India, was in Indonesia, was never really taken forward. So I think there has been a lag in terms of India-Indonesia maritime engagement that perhaps is now being reset, but it will take some time, partly because of domestic changes in Indonesia. But I would say that if you're looking at the wider picture, this is a picture where economically, diplomatically, and also in terms of partnerships, because this is where perhaps a degree of alignment has happened, that acknowledging what India perhaps can do and cannot do, acknowledging that there are limits to India's ability to do all things at all times. So therefore, certain kinds of partnerships are needed. And I think this has, the more India is engaged with its partners, whether it is Quad partners, whether it is France, I think the sense that that all countries are, are facing same dilemmas. That you really have to think more creatively. How do you balance this out amongst yourselves? Whether it means partitioning almost the region into into areas where you can bring your own capabilities to bear, or thinking more creatively about joint projects and programs. So I think that process has started, and that we will see its culmination. The other, and this is linked to the second point that you raised, because ultimately everything, most of the complaint that you hear is that this is all very strategic. Where is the economic muscle behind it? Because ultimately China has the economic muscle even today. So how do you respond? And one of the things that one of the reasons why IPEF, economic framework, came along was also because of the criticism that Biden administration was facing, that look, there is again nothing to do with economics. It's all nothing to do with with the real issue there, which for a lot of countries is important. Now, IPEF, what is interesting about economic framework and Indo-Pacific economic framework is it did not have a very good reception in India, because of course the challenges of market access. There's no market access there. It's a framework that eventually will lay the foundations of certain standards and norms on a range of issues. And therefore, for a lot of the countries that are looking for market access and that were looking for that guarantee from the US, that did not come. And I don't think it's likely to come as well, given the domestic political situation in the US. So what I've seen in the last year in terms of its evolution is that there has been a reappraisal. So while India is not part of the trade pillar, we have seen greater engagement by India on this subject, because there is this acceptance that that market access issue is not going to be resolved anytime soon, and B, that India is now also trying to shed some of that baggage of not being a country easy to do trade with. So there is a lot of these FTAs that India is moving forward with. And I was mentioning the fact that EU also is proceeding ahead. So we have seen, for example, UAE, with UAE's has a comprehensive economic partnership agreement has been signed. There is a limited agreement with Australia. There's Canada. There's UK and EU, and I think that basket is going to expand. Now, I think that means India has also acknowledged somewhere that it needs to do more on trade. It needs to do more on after it is not part of any major trade bloc, and economic dimension is extremely weak. So can India work with other countries, including with the US on IPEF, and ensure that there are some issues that perhaps can be resolved through this mechanism? So economic dimension, I think, is going to be the Achilles heel going forward. But I don't think there is any way to avoid that discussion as well, because ultimately that's where a lot of the other countries are interested in.
Thank you. There are plenty of questions. We will not be able to do justice to all of them because we are running out of time. But let's pick up some of them which are directly related to what you've said, and also some of the responses have already been offered by you. The questions came before you spoke, in fact. So let me focus on a couple of them. VD Vyas asks, how can we understand the competition for the hegemonic/influential role in the Indian Ocean region, particularly between India and China with respect to maritime choke points, nuclear capabilities, and economic influence? And I would add, to make it more concrete, what is the assessment of Sri Lanka's attitude? One of the trophies, so to speak, that China has more or less conquered, and last year's developments when some surveillance ship from China could go to Sri Lanka in spite of India's advice, quote unquote, is probably a concrete example of this competition that VD Vyas is talking about.
See, I think Sri Lanka is an excellent case and perhaps would be would be examined by scholars for years, because there we have seen, as I think you were mentioning, Christoph, there's a concreteness of this contestation. You can almost touch and feel the contest there, and I think that's very rare in international politics that you can get your hands around it, and it has happened, in just almost in real time. Before I come to Sri Lanka, I would just make 2 points. One is that India-China contestation in the Indian Ocean is a reality. It has been happening for some time, and it will continue to happen in the foreseeable future. There is no way we can ignore it, because China, as a rising power, as a power that wants to have stakes in most parts of the world, is pushing into Indian Ocean, and India is pushing back. So some of that contestation is very visible, and it has been visible for some time now. Now, the other point I want to make is that in this contestation, often smaller countries get more agency than we often realize. Smaller countries can play, and when I say small, it just means relative to the big powers that we are speaking. The countries, the neighboring countries, they find that they have two big powers to balance, and they balance off one against the other. There is often this idea that, look, if India would not take up Hambantota, Chinese would. So Rajapakshas could go there. If India is not going to, if China is not going to, is going to give you high rates of interest, you can showcase to India and say, look, this is what we are getting. Why don't you give us a better deal? So I think that agency, that sense of agency, is also empowering in some ways. Where it creates a problem is when you have ineffective governance, ineffective domestic institutional procedures. Where, for example, in the case of Rajapakshas, where it almost became a relationship, an incestuous relationship between the governing elite and China. So a lot of the projects, rather than being evaluated properly on the basis of the merits, were being processed for political reasons. And so where you also see the economic costs eventually emerging. And I think that's where Sri Lanka's case becomes interesting, because it has alerted to a number of other countries. And at the moment, by the way, South Asia is going through a terrible crisis. Apart from India, every single country has gone to the IMF in the region, and Bhutan, of course. You have Sri Lanka, you have Pakistan, of course, big crisis. You have Maldives, you have Bangladesh, and Nepal. All of these countries are facing structural problems, and they have gone to the IMF, and debt problems, huge debt burdens on these countries. Now, in Sri Lanka's case, while we can blame China, but largely it's a failure of domestic political institutions, domestic leadership, domestic governance structures. And in that sense, what we have seen is that while while China attained a huge advantage to an extent where even when the Sirisena government wanted to keep the Chinese out of Hambantota, they could not, because the terms of the loans were such that they had to sign on a 99-year-old lease. And this is a Sirisena government which was considered to be relatively pro-India. more than the Rajapakshas. And then they were, they were anti-Rajapaksa. They campaigned on the Hambantota issue, on the debt issue, and China issue. But they could not do much about it because the terms were already set. Now, what has happened, I think, is that at the moment, China is facing a backlash. And Sri Lanka is caught between a devil and the deep sea, because they need both IMF support and China's support if they have to come out of this crisis. China's debt is huge. China is the only holding out country at the moment with the IMF. Both Paris Club and India have said that we are willing to restructure debt. We are willing to work with Sri Lanka in restructuring its debt, and we are willing to even forgive some parts of it. China has not yet come out, and one can understand China's predicament because China has invested in so many countries. According to some reports, around 40 countries at the moment are in debt as part of NBRI. So China really, if China makes an exception for Sri Lanka, it faces a crisis of its own around the world. So there is a problem there. Now, what I think the result of this is that I was being told yesterday only that today in social media, Chinese, if you go to Sri Lankan social media, there is such a negative backlash against China that the moment you mention China, there are these abuses flowing in the social media, because the perception has changed. The perception is not simply that here is a country that had given us debt. The perception is also that here is a country that has not come to our aid at all. China has been missing in action. If you look at from last year to this year, Chinese have been not there in terms of even articulating a response. And that has given India a certain window of opportunity. India has come in a big way. India has given a lot of aid to almost to the tune of 4 billion, also working with towards the restructuring, and perhaps this can be utilized by India in turning some of the negativity around India's own role in the country. But my own argument will always be that whatever India will do, it will be a temporary phenomenon, because eventually India-China contestation will re-emerge in some form. It will be in Sri Lanka, it will be in Maldives, it will be in Bangladesh, it will be everywhere. So I think for those of us who are students of South Asia, I think this is now a standard feature of South Asian politics and international relations. And more research is needed, but I think empirically one can always say that this is now going to stay with us for a while.
Very interesting. Thank you. I pick up one last question from the box because we don't want to take too much of your time, Harsh. There is one interesting question by Subrangshu. Considering India's Indo-Pacific posture, is India slowly moving towards converting its Act East policy to an Act Indo-Pacific policy, or the former will work as a subset of the latter in future? How do you articulate the sub-regional, regional, and global policies? And of course, BIMSTEC would fit in this as well, as you said.
Yeah, I think Act East, you will have, a lot of thrust on Act East. Of course, most of you would know it emerges out of Look East post 1990s, where India started looking towards the East for economic reasons. Act East has a more of a strategic connotation, that it is not simply about economic relationships, but also about thinking more strategically about partners and strategic players. So we have seen a lot of investment being made, but I would say that Act East would be a subset for India of the larger Indo-Pacific policy, because Indo-Pacific for India is also West. So India is also Look West. If you see India's Look West policy, which is also fairly broadly articulated. And we have seen, one of the most remarkable shifts in India in terms of its foreign policy on the Western frontier, where India's relationships with countries like Saudi Arabia or with UAE are perhaps at their best today than they have ever been. So in a sense, Look West is also a very important part for India, where a lot of diplomatic capital is being spent because let's not forget a large part of our labor, the expatriate population, remittances, energy security, all of that is linked to the West. So, and this is again for India part of the a larger Indo-Pacific framework. So the Arabian Sea is equally important as the Bay of Bengal for India in the wider Indo-Pacific. So I would say that Act East certainly is has gained traction and has been much more debated than Look West. But India's Look West policy will also be seen and will continue to be seen as a very important part of its wider Indo-Pacific outreach. Because for India, of course, Indo-Pacific is a much wider geography.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. And the last question is by Mauro, who is in Delhi like you and in the dark now.
Thank you, Christoph. Thank you very much, Harsh, for your presentation. I would like to go back very briefly to the beginning of your presentation when you're talking about the concept of the Indo-Pacific and how it
We've lost you, Mauro. We can't hear you. Well, I'm afraid we will not be in a position to listen to Mauro's question. He'll have to ask that to you bilaterally, Harsh, I'm afraid. But please do share the response. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for this great presentation and discussion. Everything will be on the website. We will have to edit. Mauro, you're back. So please, we could hear you. We could not hear you. No, we can't hear you anymore.
Sorry. I'm very sorry. My connectivity is not good. Harsh, thank you very much for your presentation. I wanted to ask you very quickly. At the base of the idea of the Indo-Pacific, there's the vision that not South Asia is now connected to the rest of what was before the Asia-Pacific region. That what happens in one region has effects on other parts of it. So given the important relationship that India has with Japan, which is not a European or American partner, it's an Asian partner and has framed a lot the idea of the Indo-Pacific. To what extent do you think in the Indian strategic thinking, there's an understanding of the security needs that Japan has in East Asia? I'm thinking specifically about the Korean Peninsula and the potential crisis in the Strait of Taiwan. And to what extent India, given its strategic constraint of the border with China, could eventually play a role in supporting Japan in this? Thanks.
Mauro, that's a great question. Actually, India and Japan, of course, we know that there have been a lot of investment has gone into this relationship by both sides. And Abe and Manmohan Singh and Modi and Kishida today have been really invested in this relationship. And Japan, there is a comfort level with Japan, which is quite unprecedented in terms of, for example, there is Northeast, in India's Northeast, which is strategically sensitive for India. And Japan is the only country that is allowed to pursue infrastructure projects. Now, this is quite remarkable in terms of the understanding that there is between India and Japan. There are no issues, bilateral differences between the two anymore. It used to be the nuclear question used to be one. Now, I think there is a growing sense in India about how Japan is changing. And what kinds of, I think, help, support Japan might also need at times as it moves forward. Now, Japan is a very capable military power, has always been a very capable military power. It's just that it was under certain provisions of its constitution, it was not allowed to do certain things. Now, I think it is shedding some of that baggage in some areas. But I think there is a wider recognition, certainly in India, that the more Japan comes into its own, the better it would be for India. And so there is no real hesitation for India in saying that, look, Japan, a militarized Japan can pose a problem. That perception Indians don't hold. At least I have not seen anyone articulating that. In fact, what is happening in India is at the moment, because of the pressure from China, the sense is that the more like-minded countries are there in the region and present in full force in the region. That is good for India. In fact, the more France comes in, the more European Union comes in, and very interestingly, Germany, is also reevaluating its military posture. I don't know how that is being perceived in Europe, but in Asia, in India, I think that's that's being welcomed. Japanese ships have sailed into Indian Ocean. German ships have sailed into Indian Ocean. German frigates have come in. Bomber jets have come in. So it's generally seen as something that is relatively good for the region, because of obvious reasons. India feels that creates pressure points, that creates a sense of stability, overall stability in the region. So I think Indians perceive Japan as a critical anchor, and they do view that Japan is going to be an important player going forward. And for them, therefore, a strengthened Japan, a more capable Japan, a Japan that can shoulder more responsibility is good news.
Thank you very much, Harsh, and thank you for your time. We will of course, edit a little bit this recording before uploading it on our website, but it will be available very soon, and you will be invited to disseminate it. The next webinar in our series will be on the 21st of March, and that will be on Australia. We'll be very fortunate to have one of our colleagues, again from King's College, Agnieszka, at the helm of the Australia Institute, presenting the Australian view of the Indo-Pacific. So we remain within the Quad, but we'll go further east. Thank you again, and have a good evening in Delhi.
Thank you, Christoph. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.